To parody the author's address, which he has put in the mouth of the Apostle Paul on supposition, he were now to appear, we may with equal justice conceive the Apostle posing the friends of weekly communion with such enquiries as these. How do you observe the great ordinance of communion? Do you use it according to the mind of the Lord, for displaying to the world your unity in holy profession and attachment to the doctrines of the cross, for visibly attesting this unity among yourselves, confirming and sealing it throughout the body? Have you, wholly attentive to your own advantage, neglected that of the church, or the general interest of religion, and overlooked the respect that your Lord had to these? Have you, on pretense of seeking spiritual benefit and mindful of this alone, defeated in a great measure one special object he had in view, established a disconnected plan of observance, and thrust the celebration into corners? Is there not at least the appearance of selfishness here? Lay aside these partial views, and restore the sacramental feast of fellowship to that mode of celebration it requires. Letter number 3 takes up the first expected objection, innovation. Here we admit his position, that if the measure proposed, by which surely must be meant frequent, if not weekly dispensation in the same place, be our duty, it is high time the innovation was made. But it will not be so easily admitted that he has proved, as he affirms he has done, that measure either to be needful or duty, by the partial and irrelevant view of the ordinance presented in the preceding letter. He would now show, however, that so far from being an innovation, the adoption of the measure proposed would be only the restitution of what was the order of the Church from the beginning. To this purpose he appeals to Acts 20, verse 7, and from his remarks on this passage we learn, for the first time, what we are to understand by the measure proposed. Weekly communions were the constant practice of the primitive Christians. How does he make this out? The words intimate that sacramental communion was a principal, if not the principal object of their meeting. No doubt it was, in the instance and on the occasion referred to. They came together that Sabbath. The apostle was with them expressly to break bread. But what then? Prayer, praise, and the preaching of the word were their stated exercises. But of such moment was the supper considered, that in recording their employment on the Sabbath, the sacred historian mentions nothing else. They came together to break bread. Mr. Mason found it necessary to account for the historian specifying so particularly the breaking of bread, and has exerted his ingenuity to convert it to his own purpose. For in fact that very specification, since prayer, praise, and preaching were the stated exercises, intimates something peculiar in the occasion referred to. The disciples at that time came together to break bread. It was to be a sacramental Sabbath. Had the supper been one of the stated ordinances, the historian would naturally have mentioned only the meeting on the first day of the week, and the notice of its dispensation as a thing of course would have occurred merely in the account of the exercises which took place. Paul having preached and broken bread and discoursed a long while after, even till break of day, departed. To the remarks already made in section 4 on this passage and on the other 1 Corinthians 11 verse 20, which are the only ones produced by Mr. Mason to ascertain the practice in the apostolic age, the reviewer has nothing to add, nor does he think it necessary, after what has been stated in the same section, to trace the history of communicating down to the age of Reformation, or enter into new discussions on the opinions of the Reformers. In the next letter, the objections that frequent communicating would banish reverence and prevent preparation are attacked with considerable success. Various considerations, exceedingly just and happily expressed, worthy the attention of those who would excuse themselves from their duty by taking advantage of the Presbyterian plan, are here brought forth. We allow them all their force in their direction against the formalist, the hypocrite, the Pharisaic Christian. 1 hour, 1 minute of genuine humiliation, 1 tear of gracious contrition, 1 groan utterable of the spirit of adoption is of more value in the sight of God than the most splendid round of formalities. The former, indeed, are of no more value as a ground of acceptance in the Lord's Supper than the latter. But if there be any who plead preparation from the impracticability of observing the days usually appointed, as a reason for not joining with their brethren in other congregations, or for dispensing with that frequent communicating for which opportunities may be afforded, they abuse the Presbyterian plan and expose the very form of preparation they mean to support. Such Christians seem to indicate that they consider preparation as restricted to the round of external formalities, and by their conduct defeat the purpose of a circulation of fellowship throughout the body. If, however, the reasoning be meant to prove that there is no distinction among divine institutions, as is obvious from the argument brought forward, that God is not more holy in one than in another, if it also go the length of subverting the necessity of a regard to warranted means of preparation, because the bare observance of these belongs but to the form of godliness, then, on the first head, we have endeavored to detect its absurdity in our second section, and on the other, it is only needful to remark that the power of godliness is by no means inconsistent with the form. Are we to discard days of fasting in every instance because 1 hour or 1 minute of genuine contrition before God is of more value in His sight than a round of formalities? On this principle, the observance of the supper itself might be entirely set aside. One spiritual act of gratitude and remembrance of Christ is more pleasing in God's sight than the most frequent participation of symbols. The argument ought to have been guarded, but had it been guarded, it would have failed in its application to Mr. Mason's purpose. We are the less concerned with the objections discussed in this letter, as they are not much connected with the principles on which we defend the Presbyterian plan of observance. But however truly astonishing it may be that they should ever be brought forth by a living Christian, Calvin and other reformers thought they do not make nor sanction the objections, yet allow that they must be attended to in settling the plan of observance. The question is not what Christians ought to be, but what they really are, and may be expected to be in this imperfect state. And we have seen that God Himself, in diversifying His system of ordinances, was not unmindful of their state. He knoweth our frame. Mr. Mason appeals to the fact. Do other duties grow contemptible by their frequency? Prayer, for instance. We may appeal to facts more pertinent. Zephyrinus found that weekly dispensation produced not only irreverence, but disorder. Calvin allows that he consulted the interests of religion in altering the plan. He himself was afraid of weekly communion. Witzius was not without apprehension that such frequency might deprecate the ordinance. None of the Reformed churches found it expedient to ordain such frequency. But expediency is not the ground on which we support the Presbyterian method. That method is so favorable to the frequency of communicating claimed by the ordinance that Presbyterian pastors, in exhorting their people to their duty, find abundant scope for taking off the force of the very palliations and excuses referred to in the objections. Having dispatched the subject of frequency, that of the observance of days is next introduced. Here we meet with an elaborate discussion. Though the subject is brought in merely as a fourth objection against the measure proposed, yet it is protracted through no less than 4 letters, and occupies nearly the half of the book. A final blow to what he is pleased to call the customary appendages to the Lord's Supper, the redundancies of human fancy, was doubtless intended. One reflection naturally occurs on reading the title of the customary appendages, particularly public fasts and thanksgivings. No word of preparation days. Why are they overlooked? It is because they may be borne with. Is it because they may be borne with? One would have thought the very idea of preparation had been offensive to the author. It is because the topics of declamation against the fast and thanksgiving days are more numerous and afforded the most spacious reasoning. To charge him with such motives might be uncharitable. On looking into the letters, we find that he has no objection against at least a preparation sermon. He even attempts in a note an apology for it. Besides, something of the kind is allowed to be proper in certain confessions and public deeds, which he would have us to believe are wholly on his side and utterly hostile to the practice of others who adhere to them. Yet his very argument that the Church of Scotland from the dawn of the Reformation till 1638 indulged but one sentiment as to the administration of the sacraments, that is, that it was not to be encumbered with any rites contrary to or beside the written word, page 83. This argument militates against a preparation sermon or day as against the feast and thanksgiving days. The former, as really as the latter, are beside the written word, in the sense affixed by Mr. Mason to the term, and embracing the view which depends on that sense, he must discard the one as well as the other. The fact is, The rites opposed were, as Mr. Mason allows, the popish and prelatical ceremonies in the form of administration and reception, that the acts he has quoted lay down and universal rule against the imposition of rites and observances which have no foundation in the Word of God, is readily granted. But then in the same sense in which he apprehends this applies against the fast and thanksgiving days, it must apply against all forms of preparation. Even a sermon for the bare purpose of distributing tokens is beside the written word, and if solely intended for the purpose, more so than any observances in the usual Presbyterian method.